Campers, it's Miss Emily, and today in Campers Crusades for music we will be going over different genres. A music genre is a conventional category that identifies some pieces of music as belonging to a shared tradition or set of conventions. That is a very hard to pick apart definition, but it is the exact definition I wanted you guys to know. So again, music can be divided into different genres in many different ways. The artistic nature of these musics means that these classifications are often subjective and controversial, and some of these genres will overlap. The first genre we're going to talk about is the blues, and the blues is a combination of African and Western music. And some of these songs are, sad, like slow. They talk about heartbreak and pain. But then others are about being in love and having fun. And these are the very up-tempo and good to dance to songs. This genre began in the 18th and 19th centuries, but it's carried out throughout all of the century of modern century, and it's influencing jazz and soul and hip-hop still. So I said that blues influenced many different genres, and one of those genres was jazz, which is a mix of European harmony with rhythms and scales of blues. One of the greatest musicians that played jazz was a trumpet player, and his name was Louis Armstrong. Pretty sure it's Louis. Depends your pronunciation. But he helped develop many styles of jazz. And he was from New Orleans, and in the 1910s, the marching style band was the New Orleans Jazz. And so in the 1920s, he had moved to Chicago, and he was improvising many different songs and sounds and rhythms. And then by the 1930s, he was in New York City, and he began big band jazz, and swing also started to develop. So he had been very influential through multiple periods of times. By the 1950s, many young musicians didn't really want to play jazz, especially jazz orchestras, just because of they wanted the freedom to experiment and improvise in their own bands. So they actually started to branch off, and they began new styles like bebop and modal jazz. And these weren't as easy to dance to, so they weren't as popular, but they found a new audience of serious listeners for whom modern jazz was art music rather than popular music. And you probably don't know these names, but one of the well-known musicians of this new form of jazz was Charlie Parker. In the 1930s and 40s, if you have learned about this in history, we have the Great Depression and then the war. So, getting money wasn't easy, especially for people who were musicians. So, in order to make money, professional blues musicians actually formed small bands, and they would play in small bars and restaurants. And to attract really big audiences, they developed this new style, which was called rhythm and blues, and now we know it as R&B. So the early forms of R&B were really loud and lively, and they were really played on drums and double bass and electric guitar, and the singers had really big voices that the audience loved. And that style quickly spread throughout the country. Larger bands added pianos and trumpets and saxophones. It was perfect for dancing, and by the mid-1940s, many bands were selling records. There was also a number one hit in 1944 with the G.I. Jive But yeah, so later R&B artists include Ray Charles. By the early 1950s, another genre called rock and roll or rock and roll was created by musicians who could play both the R&B, so rhythm and blues, as well as Western swing, which was a very popular style of country dance music. So the new music was played on the same set of instruments as R&B, so like electric guitar, double bass, and drums, with the guitarist often singing as well. And it had a really strong blues beat with an R&B feel, but melodies were like those of country songs. And it was great to dance to, and rock and roll dance style soon developed. The lyrics were great and fun, and it became really popular really fast, especially with teenagers. A famous musician that I want to just quickly talk about for rock and roll was Elvis, and he was hugely successful. He made rock and roll one of the most popular styles in music, not only in America but across the world. And so, many of his hit singles, including Hound Dog, Heartbreak Hotel, and Jailhouse Rock, allowed him to become known as the king of rock and roll. Some people simply just called him the king. By the early 60s, a new genre called just rock music began to develop when the young musicians combined the rock and roll of Elvis with elements of R&B. Again, new styles of country music also became popular in the 60s, as did a new style of melodic R&B called soul music. And then later in the 60s, soul artists like James Brown developed a more rhythmic style called funk. And funk led to new styles of dance music in the 70s and 80s and beyond. And then in the late 70s, a new genre of hip-hop also developed. And hip-hop is now one of the most popular music styles in the world. And like all major genres of popular music, it's produced many hit singles on pop music charts. Now I'm just going to discuss with you the genres that are very popular today in 2020. The first genre is hip-hop / rap, and it is the most popular music style in 2020. It was first created in the 1970s in downtown areas that were primarily in the Bronx in New York City. And it has an adapted version of cadence music that usually, has a rap with a music and rhyming discourse that has been laid on top of that cadence. It was created as a major aspect of hip-hop culture and subculture. So, MCing, rapping, DJing, scratching, turntables, breakdancing, and, there's just lots of different cultures that we can associate now with the hip-hop genre. The next genre is one that I personally am not a big fan of, and that is techno. So techno is a type of electronic dance music that began in Detroit, Michigan in the mid to late 1980s. It is commonly monotonous and frequently delivered for use in a continuous DJ set. So, the central rhythm is regularly in manner time, while the rhythm changes somewhere in the range of 120 to 150 for a moment. So, it is steady, and then it increases really, really high and really fast, and then it goes back down. Specialists can utilize a lot of the electronic instruments like drum machines and sequencers, just as computerized sound workstations. So a example of techno music style is called vibrancy, if you heard of that. The next genre, so the third number in our list, has been around since the 1940s. I talked about it earlier. Yes, it's R&B, so rhythm and blues. and it uses the guitars and drums and sometimes saxophone, and it talks about the mixture of business cadence and blues music that was really popular in the 1950s through the 1970s. The next genre is punk rock. It's a music type that began in the mid-1970s. It was established in a 1960s garage rock. Punk groups dismissed the overabundancies of standard 1970s rock. So people were like, that's not good enough, and then just changed it. They're regularly created short, quick-paced tunes with hard-edged songs and singing styles, stripped-down instrumentation, and then it actually has a lot of political verses. It has a grasp on DIY ethnic, so, numerous groups of self-producing chronicles circulate them through the independent record labels. So there's not really like a producing company that's like labeled as punk. So they kind of have to do their own record and like their own advertising, because not a lot of people are really looking for that punk rock. Next is alternative rock, and it is a style of rock music that emerged from the independent music underground of the 1970s and turned out to be really famous in the 1980s. So in this case, alternative alludes to the class's qualification from standard exciting music. So they think that people are more likely to favor the regular rock, so they wanted to make like a different alt rock. And this unique significance is more extensive and alluding to an age of performers bound together by the obligation to the melodic style and also just to be free. In spite of the fact that the class advanced in the late 1970s and 1980s, music foreseeing the sound of the class can be found as right on time as the 1960s, with groups, for example, the Velvet Underground and Specialists, Syd Barrett. Another genre, house, is a kind of electronic dance with a constant beat, for the most part between 120 and 130 beats every minute. It was made by disc jockeys and music makers from Chicago's underground club culture in the early and mid-1980s. The DJs kind of modified this disco dance, gave them an increasingly mechanical beat and more profound bass lines. It's kind of cool. Next is country music, which is also known as country and western, as well as hillbilly. It is sort of well known. It began in the southern states in the mid-1920s, and for example, American people music, particularly Appalachian and Western, as well as blues. So it regularly comprises of anthems and move tunes with commonly straightforward structures, people verses, and harmonies, generally joined by string instruments like banjos. Next is indie rock, which is a kind of music that began in the United States and United Kingdom during the 1970s and was initially used to portray independent record labels, which the term became related to the music, so indie and independent. They delivered and was at first utilized reciprocally with alternative rock. So alternative rock and indie music, or indie rock, kind of get like flipped around. Like people don't really know like the difference. Next is Electro, and it's a type of electronic music, just like techno, and early HipHop. Really, was affected by the utilization of certain drum machines and funk. So electro is early hip hop that has been affected by funk. These records usually include drum machines and electronic sounds without vocals, and it goes astray from like the ancestor boogie for being less vocal situated and progressively centered around electronic beats delivered by the drum machines. Next is Latin music, and actually this is our last genre we'll be talking about, and it is a genre that the music industry uses as a catch-all term for music that comes from Spanish and Portuguese speaking areas of the world, like the Iberian Peninsula and South America. It originated from the U.S. due to the growing influence of the Hispanic and Latin American peoples in the music market that were happening in America. This is a very influential genre for modern day. Now I'm just going to name 2 songs, and I want you to think in your head where they might fit based on, the kinds of things you're hearing. So if you're hearing lyrics, obviously it's not going to be electro, funk, and, if you're hearing Spanish or Portuguese, it's going to probably be Latin. The first song, it was very popular last summer. It is Old Town Road. So think in your head, where do you think Old Town Road would fit on our scheme of 10 genres that I just talked about? If you said hip-hop, you're right. Yes, Old Town Road is very, very hip-hop. Now, our second song and our last song we're going to talk about, it has some Spanish in it, so think. And it's Despacito. Where does Despacito belong in our array of genres? Yes, it is Latin music. So if you said Latin music, you are correct. And that means that you have a pretty decent grasp on this whole genre. And, now when you listen on the radio, you hear a song and you're like, oh, there's no lyrics. Oh, it's a really strong beat. This must be either techno or electro funk. And it's kind of cool just, to sit there and listen to songs on the radio and think in your head, like, where does this belong? I didn't really cover pop because pop is really a genre that's made up of like all the genres. So just, the songs that are really, really popular and people are listening to a lot of. I hope you found finding out about genres to be fun and, just, play your radio game, think in your head, oh, that song has some Spanish in it. It must be Latin music. I hope you found this informational and fun, and stay tuned for our next lesson.